Hello, everyone. I'm Janine Kakmar, Head of Public Services at the Palos Heights Public Library. Many of you know me from the programs I plan here, and today I'm here with a very special guest to talk about an important program we have coming up on November 10th. We Can Walk Together, Exploring Race in America. So let me introduce Jim Bowie. Jim is a Chicago-based documentary artist whose work explores the issues of human rights and social connection. So welcome, Jim. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Jim has spent his career covering a wide range of global and social stories, from the war in Bosnia to Hurricane Katrina. His photography and writing have been featured in the New York Times, Time Magazine, the Associated Press, as well as numerous other exhibitions. He's building on his career as an international photojournalist, an editor, and a professor of art and media. And Jim creates what he calls Interactivations that combine documentary storytelling, visual art, and live programs in an art form that promotes empathy and bridges social divisions. So he brings that same format to his latest project, We Can Walk Together, which will be an exhibition of powerful portraits and deeply personal stories that spark a transformative conversation about race in our individual lives and in our society. So Jim, tell us, how did you get started on this type of project?
Well, as you so wonderfully outlined my work, thank you. You revealed a little something for this discussion, which is I focus my work primarily on how I can use art to bridge social division. So what is the context by which we can better understand each other? And I try to use art to do that, and particularly photography combined with story. So for me, when the George Floyd killing happened, that was such an important moment for our society, but also an inspirational, a motivating moment for me as an artist who works in the area of social division. And I think what was so powerful about that, and all of us have had our own individual experiences with it, but if I can put sort of my analyst cap on, I think that photo made something incredibly intimately personal, that we saw a man with a story who cried out for his mother, and it made it real and it made it visceral in a way that we couldn't turn away. But most importantly, I think that it triggered something. It triggered an empathetic reaction. We spend so much of our day engaging in these issues from the abstractions of slogans and statistics and news headlines. But when it's brought down in that simple, distilled, and powerful way of one human being's story connecting to another across that video channel, I think that it created an opportunity for us to really change the way we're discussing race in this country. But my concern is the concern that we always have as we try to create and bridge understanding. And that is that often those moments are followed quickly by a regression to sloganeering, to the abstractions. And those slogans, those abstractions, are usually what we use to divide ourselves, right? Do we agree that, quote unquote, Black Lives Matter? Do we agree that we need law and order? And they become ways of dividing us. They became delineating points. And so we lose that story. We lose that intimate connection. And so my feeling is that if we're going to advance this dialogue at this moment in time, we have to keep that empathetic connection open. And it's through empathetic connection, the realization that another story is shared by you, and that another's experience is much like your own. When we can keep that open, when we can maintain that connection to each other, that's when understanding can happen. And so with that motivation, with that task I gave myself, I set out to try to produce this project, to try to keep this dialogue open and ongoing about how we consider ourselves and consider race in this country.
Okay, great. And the title of it, We Can Walk Together, that comes from a little story you mentioned earlier. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So the title of the project is based on a Lilla Watson quote. And Lilla Watson is a relatively famous Aboriginal Australian artist, activist. And she has this quote in one of her writings that has always been inspiring to me. And it's, "If you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you recognize that your liberation and mine are bound together, we can walk together." And what happened is that as I was creating this project, like every project, I usually am thinking about it throughout the day. I'm thinking about it and all the various things I'm doing. And I had begun interviewing people for the project and thinking about it. And I usually don't strike a theme. I don't really know what a project is about. One of the disciplines that I do in my work is I'm very careful to let the stories become the story, as opposed to oftentimes we as storytellers will set out with a story in mind and try to find the things that create the story we intended to tell. But for me, that discipline is very much you are engaging people and you work with the discovery of what stories people share. So as those stories were coming out, I was learning about myself. I was learning about what this project would be about, and themes started to arise. And then I remember one morning I was getting ready for work. I was getting dressed as usual, thinking about the project. And I had a thought, and it was a challenging thought, and I was a little embarrassed about it, which was that I would be nervous to walk with the subjects of this project in their neighborhoods. And now I'm someone who's covered war and very difficult situations around the world, but I would be a little nervous walking with somebody just a couple miles from where I live. And that really challenged me. As I said, I was embarrassed by it, and that I even felt that way. And so the idea then very quickly became about walking, and that I felt like this is what I have to do. That given that challenge, I need to walk with people. And of course, very quickly, it just brought together all those themes of how we understand each other when we walk in their footsteps, what conversation does, and so forth. And so very quickly, literally before I had finished dressing, that became the work, that I would walk with people in their neighborhoods, and that would become the foundation of the project. And so I literally went half dressed immediately to my computer. I remembered the Lilla Watson quote, but I Googled it. There it was. And I was like, that's the title. And
Oh, wow.
that became
Well, it
the
just
project.
melts right together then.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then, and I can say, the great gift of the project for me, and I hope that will happen as we engage audiences and engage a greater conversation as a community, is that we all are reminded of the fact that you really don't know until you've walked with somebody. We think we know, but we really don't know until you've had that walk. And that's what this project's all about.
Excellent. Well, thanks. That's a great explanation. So you'll be using your photographs. So let's talk a little bit about your photographs. You have a unique style. Can you tell us a little bit about that, the style you have?
Yeah. So thank you. I hope it's somewhat unique. That's the goal of an artist, to try to find your voice and try to find what that is. And for me, my primary objective when I'm creating bodies of work, when I'm creating exhibitions, is to create an empathetic context. And we alluded to that earlier in my earlier remarks, but that what oftentimes I feel like we're dealing with is, we're so much in this fractured media society that has been promoting a more fractured civic society generally. And a big part of that is that our current media universe creates a certain relationship to information. It's a relationship to information that is primarily based on holding your attention through quick, responsive pieces of media. And that engages us in a certain way. In particular, in neuroscientific terms, it engages us through our amygdala. It engages our reactive sense. But as we all know, if we've ever been startled by a snake in the yard or a bug on the window, we all know that our amygdala is not exactly the place for understanding. The amygdala is that place for reaction. It holds our attention, but it does not create understanding. And so what I've tried to do with my work is to begin to break that down and say, how can art create understanding? And I think the way it does and the way it can is it has to create empathy. But there's a particular language of empathy. And the language of empathy in my mind, and what I'm trying to put forward is that empathy is derived by the space between. That when we're faced with a whole lot of information, we select out information, and we select out very quickly based on our biases, based on our quick responses, etc. But when you're engaged in empathy, something else is happening. But the way it happens is that when you allow space for people to fill in their own imagination, their own experience, the way they think about things. So I use a very spare style. And I'll share with you an image right now from an exhibition that is currently traveling around the country on refugees called When Home Won't Let You Stay. And I'll pull up an image for you here and we'll take a look at this. This is an image of a young woman named Zaina, and she is from Baghdad, Iraq. And much like I do in all my work, and much like I'm doing in this current project, I go out and meet people and I ask people to share their stories. And this photograph is taken in her living room in northern Minneapolis in Minnesota. And we're talking about what happened to her as a young child in Baghdad, Iraq. But as you notice, most of the image is really built around the light and shadow. And then also the negative space, which is from the wall that's behind her. But the intent of that is that two things are happening. You're pulled into the subject, I hope, but then also that space suggests the story beyond. That her emotion and what is happening and you're connecting with is evident in the frame, but that the space of the frame indicates something else. And then I combine my images with text, and the text I get from very long interviews with subjects. And then I go through the transcripts of the interviews and I look for what I consider to be little found poems. They're these little moments that are open-ended and sort of speak without a lot of detail, but hopefully engage the viewer to think about it differently. And so here is the story of Zaina, and she says simply in this passage, "I was 12 years old. All I remember is the shouting, and I see my uncle killed. That's all. And my mother screaming." And to me, why that works is that it's actually, if you think about it, it's all we really need to know. We could have a chapter about Zaina's story. It's a very, very long and difficult journey that she's been under. But in a way, this captures it all. But I think it captures us in a way that we put our own empathy into the story, that we fill in the space between these lines, and we fill in the details from our own emotional experiences throughout our life. We don't have to experience directly what she has experienced, but we can all relate to what it would be like to hear your mother screaming, to see your uncle killed. And that's all in a way we really need to know. But most importantly, if we establish that, we're open to that, we're imagining the experience of another person, I think that's when understanding begins. When you're in that mindset, and I think the mindset that I hope the audience feels when they see both this image and the text, that's a very different mindset than that amygdala mindset I talked about earlier when we were referring to how we react to media.
Right. That's fascinating. We know that we'll announce to everybody that the images that you will be using in our program will be debuting at our event on November 12th. But my question, I wanted to know, how did you choose the photographs that you did, or how did you choose the people, the specific people? Do you look for something specific? Do you look anything for particular when you have a photograph? I'm kind of curious about your creative process with that.
Yes, so thank you. So my work is very much about the discovery. So and it's much more labor intensive, but I do not I try very much not to prejudge the story. And I think this is probably, it's been one of the great learning lessons in my life, and I have to relearn it over and over again, is that oftentimes what I think I want is not the best thing. And I have to relearn that every single time. And I go into a story and I have a certain idea of what this story is going to become, and the accolades that it's going to get and how fantastic it's going to be. And of course, things don't turn out that way at all. And I go through a period where I'm upset and I'm not getting what I want and I'm frustrated. But then upon reflection, it turns out that that was actually what I needed all along. Ironically, just to build on that a little bit, the Zina photograph that we just showed is an example of that. When I photographed Zina, I walked away thinking that I had failed.
Really?
And the reason that I thought I had failed is that as a documentarian, as a journalist, or someone who interviews people for a living, I just told you that these stories come out of very long interviews with people. Except what I didn't tell you is that in the case of Zina, that little bit of text you saw was everything she told me in the entire interview. She suffers from a great deal of post-traumatic stress, and she went from being a very vivacious young girl to being now a very quiet young woman. And so for her to talk to me at all was a real act of bravery, for her to share the most difficult time and the most difficult trauma of her life. But in doing so, she spoke very, very few words. And those words is everything that she said in a half hour. And as someone that was locked into sort of my journalistic mindset, my documentary mindset, that for me to go and do an interview and only get that many lines was a failure. And so I walked out of there being dejected and thinking, you know, she's a beautiful woman. I was captured by her spirit and I was captured by her experience, but I'm thinking to myself, how can I use this? And then I got out to the car and I had this moment where I was like, you know what she said is everything. It's all I need to know. And that process where I thought I had failed actually then became the way I did the entire series of these very short, open-ended pieces. So she taught me, and in a way, everything I've just been telling you about, you know, sounding like I know what I'm talking about in terms of empathy, she actually taught me that. And I discovered that approach because of what I thought was the failure of that particular assignment.
Amazing. The creative process can be so mysterious at times.
Yes, and we really, I think, you know, it's about being open to where it takes you.
Yeah.
And I think if you can be open to where it takes you and keep seeing those things as potential ahas, right? Well, it's always an aha moment, but I think you get more aha moments on the things that don't go the way you expect them to go than you do on the things that do. So anyway, so I'm very much a big believer in going to regular people and doing it as at random as possible. So because I believe very strongly that the stories of what I'm calling regular people, but it's people, tell us everything we need to know. The world is filled with all the wisdom we need. We just need to tap into it. And unfortunately, the way we tap into it is through what in journalism terms is often called the usual suspects. You call the people that you know will answer their phone, you call the people in power, you call the people that have a certain celebrity, and they become the story. And that becomes the way we look at these things. But for me, it's really about going to the grassroots. It's going to people's living rooms. It's meeting people on street corners. It's meeting people at random and discovering what happens in that process. So I maintain that in all of my work, and that's what I've maintained in this particular case. So what I do is I start calling people that might want to talk to me. I ask people on the street that might want to talk to me. I ask people to suggest people that might want to talk to me, and as much as possible, find people at random. And of course, as you know, that was a particularly tricky process in the time of COVID. So that was a little more difficult. And so I would put out feelers and try to get people to respond and ask people to introduce me to people that they knew. And then I was able to set up Zoom interviews, and Zoom interviews is how this project started. And then I was able to go out and do in-person walks and interviews with people when things got a little bit more under control.
I was curious, how receptive are people when you do reach out to them? And how many did you reach out to have your, to create a project,
Yes. So I'm going to answer, it's a beautiful, that's a really important question for me. So if you don't mind, I'm going to answer that I'm going to answer it rather lengthy, with a rather lengthy answer.
That's good.
For me too, our first reaction, our assumption is that asking people to share their stories is very difficult. But in fact, the great gift of my life has been what I have learned from talking to people and learning their stories. But even more importantly than that is the recognition and the experience of the generosity of people sharing their stories. Typically, I cover things that are difficult: refugees, war, food, racism. And yet I have found over and over and over again that people are willing and generous with their story. And for me, what that speaks to is, I think, something fundamental about what it is to be human and what stories do in our humanity. When I was covering the war in Bosnia, I was a greenhorn photojournalist. It was my first big assignment. And as I was meeting refugees from the war inside of Bosnia, they would say to me, "Please tell our story so we will not be forgotten." And that, as a young journalist, that became sort of the mantra for my career and the mantra for my life. That what I was doing was not anymore about me and what I could do with a camera. It was about serving their story. And so all I'm doing is I'm going out, I'm finding the wisdom of everyday people and bringing that out to an audience in a way that an audience can engage. But it's their wisdom and it's their story that teaches us. And most importantly, what they taught me was, in that process, in the most difficult moments of their life, to share their story, because they believed if people knew their story, things would be different. That they taught me this profound kind of human faith and human trust in story. And I think we've all experienced that at different times in our life, that if you tell your story and someone listens to it, it will make a difference. And that, in many ways, I think, is the connective tissue. It's what connects us all, is that innate understanding of and trust in story. And so that's what I go out to try to do, is I'm just out there finding and encountering stories and then serving that story in a way that it can be brought into dialogue with a greater number of people.
Is there a certain way to begin a conversation with a stranger like this, or where do you begin?
I think the most important thing is that for people you're talking to understand what your intent is. So I think, and I don't know that you can do that in any sort of explicit way. It's really about the relationship, even early on, the feeling that you're able to present. And that is that they trust that you are there to serve their story. Not that that would be put in quite those terms, but oftentimes stories get used. Well, stories get used, right? They get used in a variety of ways. They get used to to make an argument. They get used to fill a newscast. They get used, and so there are legion examples of journalists kind of running and grabbing and going, right? They run in, they get their photo, and they're off. And I think for me, what it's really about is that the story that comes out of being in a relationship with people. And if that trust is there, the stories almost always follow.
Mhm.
I've been rejected very few. I mean, I shouldn't say very few. I've been rejected, but you would be surprised how many people, the vast majority of people, are willing to be interviewed and willing to talk about it in the right situation. And
Okay.
I guess, I feel like I've done a lot of work thinking about my intent. And so that gives me a certain confidence to approach it. Um, and then we go from there.
Right. As you as an artist or a photographer, you spend your life working with images. But how does an average person like myself look at a photograph in a way that, like, is there a right or wrong way to look at a photograph? I'll just ask that.
As a short answer, I don't believe there is a right or wrong way to look at a photograph. However, you do have to look. And I think that oftentimes our challenge in our everyday life is to stop and look. And so, what's happening in a photograph or in any piece of visual art is that the artist has a certain intent of what they're trying to communicate. And then they have created a visual language to present that to you. And in that visual language, by their use of color and their use of composition and their choice of subject matter, they are arranging things with a certain idea in mind and a certain form of expression in mind. And what they're asking you to do is and what they're calling you to do is take a look. And so what we do as viewers then is, if we are open to it, is we take a look, but also taking a look deeply in that sense of what is the language of this artist? What is this artist presenting to me? And taking that time to consider how these various elements within the frame are communicating to me. And when you do that, you're fulfilling what that artist is hoping to do in the type of engagement that they're creating. Oftentimes, as you know, is a lot of times people, particularly in forms of art that they're not particularly comfortable with, they usually glance and go, or they're not interested, or they move on. But the best thing that you can do with a piece of art, like what you can do with a human being, is to stop and look and listen, but listen for that intent. What is that? What is the language that this artist is presenting to me? And what is it that they're trying to say through that language?
It's interesting because you have your you said about the intent, and then you're having any number of people that are going to be participating, joining the program in November. They'll be looking at it with their own lens, like you said. So does it, I mean, as an artist, how do you get intent to translate to all these different types of people? You know what I mean? It's
Right. That's a great
that's a
question.
trick.
So, in other words, if I'm hearing you right, sort of what you're saying is, well, yes, but then everybody could walk away with a different opinion. Is that is
Yeah, we're all
and
different.
so
We have
yeah.
different.
So how do you do that? And for me, and everybody's different. But I think that that's actually the gist of the matter, and why art is different than advertising, and art is different than public relations or persuasion. In that, what we're not trying to do is to say, you need to think this way.
Hmm.
We are presenting ideas. We are trying to take the idea in our head and put it in some way in yours. But that, and I can only really speak personally on this, but what I'm trying to do is to bring people into an intimate encounter with another person's story. And I trust that if we do that, the right things will happen. And I'm not saying that I know what the right things will happen. As I mentioned earlier, that a lot of times what I think is the right thing to happen is not. What I do believe, though, is that when we are in a place of empathy, when we're in a place of understanding, right things follow.
Okay.
And so what I try to do is to create a context, and that's my objective. And so if my artistic language puts you in a context of empathy, then I've achieved what I need to do. And then what that particular experience is for you, what your walkaway is, how that might activate you in your personal or civic life. I'm open to whatever that might be, and I don't try to dictate what that is.
Interesting difference that you pointed out there, that there is a difference. I never stopped to think about it, but that's my own neophyte of artistic experience about the difference between advertising and publicity and art. You aren't trying to tell somebody what to think. But I also wanted to point out to everybody is that this program is a bit different than other programs that we've had, because those who actually sign up will have the opportunity to begin their involvement with the program right away with pre-engagement exercises that we're going to talk about. So this program is scheduled for November 10th, but once you register, you can automatically begin your journey on learning more about the topics that Jim is talking about. So Jim, I think is that part of what we call your interactivations?
Right. So what we've been describing generally today is what I call my works of art. It's the name I give them, is I call them interactivations.
Oh, okay.
And the reason I call them interactivations, this term that I made up for my work, is that idea of combining human interaction and movement and connection and encounter. And I feel like that all sort of blends together in this word that I've created called interactivations. And so typically my projects always include some sort of a physical exhibition that creates an encounter with works of art. And then also includes community programs where people can gather. I usually incorporate my own artistic monologues along with the work and along with community discussions and panel discussions. So every work of art and every presentation of that art, wherever the art goes, if it's at a particular library or it's at a particular gallery, every presentation of the work is different because the programming around the work and how the work is hung, or the room it's in, is always different. But each one of these, although it's different every time, I call an interactivation, where we're getting people to interact and activate in their own way in different ways. And so that's kind of the term I use for putting these out there. And so then I have a online virtual space that I call Interactivations. And within Interactivations, I have something called Interactivations Lab, which is taking these interactivations and putting them in events, in webinars, in courses that allow for us to dig deeper. Because one of the things that's come out of my work is audiences almost always ask in their follow-up surveys for more. And so this is the way to build more into individual projects. So as was mentioned, is for this project, we'll have a little piece of what we call countdown, where you can engage and start thinking about different things regarding this project. For example, actually this will be in the newsletter, but it'll also be in the countdown section. We're going to have a little reflection on Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. We'll also have another little countdown will be a little survey to kind of think about how you might consider certain racial issues, but also then that gives us information about how we all feel about them, and then we'll bring that into our conversation that we have with the library. And then, of course, we also have a walkaway section where you can also come to Interactivations Lab, and you'll have some walkaway materials that you can also engage if you want to go deeper. So the idea is that we create these engagements, and both before and after the event, that creates in total what I call an interactivation. So you can do as much or as little as you want. Show up and be a part of our virtual event, the webinar, or you can also go deeper by exploring content and topics that I make available through that channel.
That's great. Because we do get, especially after, the event that happened with the death of George Floyd, we get a lot of calls from folks at the library. They're looking for content. They're looking for things to read. They want to know. They just don't know where to turn. Or where to begin. So this is I'm so excited about this factor of this program, these pre-engagement, in the ideas of, getting involved with the program right away once they registered, and then continuing on afterwards. So that is an exciting part. And I know that there are other people out in the community that have been looking for that kind of thing. So, as an artist, what do you hope that people, get out of this experience?
Well, one of my favorite all-time quotes is from the political theorist, refugee to America, Hannah Arendt, who did a lot of her academic and writing work after World War II and her experience. She covered the Nazi trials and so forth, and she has a wonderful body of work. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the great work she's done and the great writings that she's done. But she has a quote, and I'll paraphrase it, but she says, the world is not humane just because it's made by human beings. And she goes on to say that it needs to become about dialogue. And she says, through dialogue, then we learn to be human. And I love that idea that we learn to be human, that we are all, in my conception of that we're all on this shared journey of trying to become more human, both as individuals and as a society. And I think that for me, this is my little tiny contribution to that nothing that I do has that big of an effect, but that it is part of this much, much larger dialogue of all of us trying to become human. So I think that, what I hope that people will engage photographs and engage stories in a way that opens up that sense of empathetic connection to the world around them, that gives them a feeling and a way of seeing that opens them up to more and deeper understanding. And in that little tiny way that each and every one of us in our daily lives can contribute to that one tiny step towards becoming more human, so that we look and talk and share and think. And the more we do that, the more human we become.
Well, Jim, that is an excellent place for us to leave off. Matt, you want to go ahead? First of all, Jim, thanks for being with us today. Folks out there, get ready for this program. It's coming up. We Can Walk Together, coming up on November 10th at the library. Register now, because then once you register, you'll be getting a separate email with a link so that you can begin this journey of learning all more about and getting prepared for this incredible event. Jim, again, thank you so much for being with us this morning and sharing us, giving some information for folks who can have questions about this. We hope to see everybody there on November 10th at 6:30. This is, again, a virtual program, folks, so you do need to register at our website at phlibrary.org. Register, we'll get you all set up, and then we'll see you guys on November 10th back with Jim, and he's going to be debuting those photographs that he's been talking about, which I'm very excited to see. So again, Jim, thank you so much, and thank you folks for watching. We'll see you next time.